The last loaf of bread sat wrapped in cloth on Grace Whitmore's lap, and her hands would not stop shaking. She had counted the coins in her pocket 3 times already, and every time the number stayed the same. Not enough. Not even close to enough. The rent was due by sundown, and if she did not sell this bread for a fair price, her family would be sleeping in the cold by nightfall. She walked faster along the narrow road that led to the village market, her boots cracking against frozen mud. The morning air bit at her cheeks, and she pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Behind her, smoke rose from the chimney of the small cottage where her mother lay sick in bed, too weak to rise, too proud to admit how frightened she was. Grace had promised her mother that everything would be fine. She was not sure she believed it herself. The road curved past a stretch of bare trees, and that was when she heard it. A low groan, barely more than a breath, coming from the ditch beside the path. She stopped walking. Her first instinct was to hurry on. Strangers on empty roads were rarely good news, and she had heard stories of thieves who pretended to be hurt so they could rob honest travelers. But the sound came again, weaker this time, and something in it made her chest tighten. She stepped closer and looked down into the ditch. A man lay there, half covered in fallen leaves, his clothes torn and stained dark at the shoulder. His face was pale, streaked with dirt, and his eyes were closed. For a moment she thought he was already dead. Then his chest rose, just barely, and she realized he was still breathing. Grace looked around. The road was empty in both directions. No one else was coming to help him. If she left him there, he would likely not survive the day. She knelt beside him despite every warning in her mind, telling her to walk away. Up close, she could see the wound at his shoulder was deep, and dried blood had crusted along his sleeve. His hands, she noticed, were rough in some places and strangely soft in others, as if he had not always lived a hard life. His boots were fine leather, though caked in mud, and beneath the grime his coat looked like it had once been well made. "Can you hear me?" she asked, her voice low. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then slowly found her face. He tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. His lips were cracked from thirst. "Do not try to talk," she said. "I am going to help you." She did not know why she said it. She had no money for a doctor, no cart to carry him, and a mother waiting at home who needed her just as badly. But something about the way his eyes held hers, desperate and trusting all at once, made it impossible for her to turn back. With great effort, she helped him sit up. He was heavier than she expected, and the strain of lifting him made her arms ache, but she managed to get him upright against a tree. He winced with every movement, and a low sound of pain escaped him, though he tried to hide it. "Water," he finally whispered. She had none with her. She had left the cottage in such a hurry that morning, thinking only of the bread and the debt, that she had not thought to bring anything to drink. She looked down at the loaf in her hands, still wrapped in cloth, the only thing standing between her family and eviction. She unwrapped it slowly. It was not water, but it was food, and food might keep him alive until she could find something better. She broke off a piece and held it to his lips. "Eat," she said, slowly. He looked at the bread, then at her, confusion crossing his face as if he could not understand why a stranger would give away something so precious to a man she did not know. But hunger and weakness won over hesitation, and he took the piece from her hand and ate it carefully, chewing with effort. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice a little stronger now. Grace broke off another piece for herself, if only to prove to her own racing thoughts that she was not giving everything away foolishly. But watching him eat, watching the color slowly return to his face, she found she did not regret it. Whatever price she would pay later for arriving at the market with less bread to sell, it felt right in this moment. "What happened to you?" she asked, glancing at the wound on his shoulder. He hesitated before answering. "Men attacked me on the road, took what I was carrying. I do not remember much after that. I must have wandered before I fell here. Do you have a name?" Again he paused, just a beat too long, as if deciding something. "Sebastian," he said finally. "Just Sebastian? For now, that will have to do." She studied him for a moment, noting the strange, careful way he chose his words, but she did not press further. People in trouble often had reasons to stay quiet about themselves, and she was not about to demand answers from a man who could barely sit upright. "My name is Grace," she told him. "My cottage is not far from here. You cannot stay in this ditch. If the cold does not finish what those men started, something else will." "I do not wish to be a burden," he said. "You already are one," she replied, though not unkindly, "so there is no use pretending otherwise. Can you walk if I help you?" He nodded, though the movement clearly cost him effort. Grace positioned herself under his good arm and helped him rise, bearing as much of his weight as she could manage. He stumbled, caught himself, and together they began the slow walk back toward her home. Every few steps he had to pause, breathing hard, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. Grace said nothing about the delay. She simply waited, steadying him, until he found the strength to continue. By the time they reached the cottage, the sun had climbed higher, and Grace knew she had already lost her chance to reach the market before the best hours of trade were gone. She pushed the thought aside. There would be time to worry about the rent later. Right now, there was a man who needed care, and her mother inside who needed to know what had happened. She eased Sebastian through the door and guided him to the small bed near the fire, the one usually reserved for guests, though guests were rare in a home as poor as theirs. Her mother stirred at the sound of footsteps and lifted her head weakly from her own bed across the room. "Grace? Who is that?" "A man I found on the road, Mother. He is hurt. I could not leave him there." Her mother's eyes, tired and pale from illness, studied the stranger with a mixture of worry and something softer. "You did right, child," she said quietly, though the strain in her voice betrayed how much even those few words cost her. Grace fetched water and a clean cloth and began cleaning the wound at Sebastian's shoulder as gently as she could. He hissed in pain but did not pull away, watching her work with an expression she could not quite read. It was not the look of a man used to being cared for. It was something closer to wonder. "You did not have to do any of this," he said quietly, as she wrapped a fresh bandage around the wound. "You do not know me. I could be dangerous." "You could be," Grace agreed, tying off the cloth. "But you are not standing over me with a weapon. And you did not ask me to give you my bread. You needed help, and I was the only one there to give it. That is all there is to it." He watched her for a long moment, and something in his gaze shifted, as if he were seeing her more clearly now than he had before. "Not many people are like you," he said. Grace shrugged as she gathered the bloodied cloth to wash it. "You sound as though you have met a great many people to compare me against." "More than most," he said, and there was a strange weight behind the words, as though he were holding back a much longer answer. "In my experience, kindness like yours is rare. People tend to ask what they will gain before they ask how they can help." "Then you have been keeping company with the wrong sort of people," Grace said, only half joking. "Perhaps I have," he admitted, and for a moment something like sadness crossed his face before he pushed it away. "Or perhaps I simply forgot that people like you still exist." Grace paused in her work and looked at him properly, taking in the exhaustion carved into his features, the way his shoulders sat stiff even in rest, as though he carried burdens far heavier than a wound. She wondered, briefly, what kind of life left a man so guarded, so careful with every word, yet so struck by a simple act of decency. But she did not ask. Whatever weighed on him was his own to share, in his own time, and she had learned long ago not to pry into wounds that were not visible. "Most people would say the same thing about being foolish," Grace replied, managing a tired smile. "My mother always says my heart runs faster than my sense. I think your heart runs exactly where it should." She did not know how to answer that, so she busied herself instead with building up the fire, adding what little wood remained by the hearth. Outside, the day was slipping away, and with it, her chance to sell what bread she had left. She pushed the worry down. Whatever came next, she would face it. For now, there was a stranger recovering by her fire, a man with careful words and eyes that seemed to carry more weight than his torn clothes suggested. She did not know his full name. She did not know why armed men had attacked him on a quiet village road, or why his hands seemed unused to hard labor despite the state of his clothing. She only knew that something about him felt important, in a way she could not yet explain, and that the choice she had made that morning, to share her last meal instead of walking past a stranger in need, was about to change everything she thought she understood about her own small life. Night fell over the cottage, and as her mother slept and the fire crackled low, Grace sat beside Sebastian's bed, watching his breathing steady into something closer to peace. She had no way of knowing that the man resting under her roof was not simply a traveler who had lost his way. She had no way of knowing that come morning, riders would arrive from the great estate beyond the hills, searching every village and every road for a man who had vanished 3 days before. A man whose true name was known throughout the entire county, spoken with respect by lords and feared by those who wished him harm. For now, he was only Sebastian, a stranger she had chosen to save. And that choice, made with nothing more than a loaf of bread and an open heart, had already set into motion a chain of events far larger than Grace could imagine. By the third morning, Sebastian could sit up without help, though the effort still cost him more than he liked to admit. Grace found him awake before dawn, staring into the dying embers of the fire with an expression she could not read, as though his mind had traveled somewhere far beyond the small cottage walls. "You should be resting," she said, setting down a bowl of thin porridge beside his bed. It was not much, but it was warm, and warm food was scarce enough that she considered it a small victory to have any at all. "I have rested enough to make an old man jealous," he said, managing a faint smile. "My body wants to move even if my shoulder disagrees." "Your shoulder will win that argument for another few days yet," Grace replied, kneeling to check the bandage. The wound looked better than it had, the swelling reduced, though the skin around it was still an angry shade of red. "You are lucky it did not turn foul. Out here, a wound like that could easily have taken your life instead of just your strength." "I am aware of how close it came," he said quietly. "I think about it more than I would like." Grace glanced up at him, catching the shadow that passed behind his eyes. In the days since she had found him, she had learned little about the man beyond his name, and the fact that he had been attacked and robbed on the road. He spoke carefully, as if every word were being weighed before it left his mouth, and though he thanked her often for her care, he offered almost nothing about who he was or where he had been going. "Will you tell me what happened to you?" she asked, sitting back on her heels. "Truly, this time, not the short version you gave the first night." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the crackle of the fire and her mother's soft breathing from across the room. "I was traveling with two men I trusted," he finally said. "We were ambushed. I do not know if the attack was random or planned, but it did not feel random. The men who struck me knew exactly where to find us, and they moved as though they had done such work before." "Do you know why anyone would want to hurt you?" "I have my suspicions," he said, and something hardened in his voice, a coldness Grace had not heard from him before. "But suspicion is not proof, and until I have proof, I intend to keep those thoughts to myself." Grace did not push further, though her curiosity burned. Instead, she busied herself with the morning chores, feeding what little grain remained to the two chickens behind the cottage, mending a tear in her mother's blanket, checking the meager stock of firewood that would not last the week. Sebastian watched her from his bed, and more than once she caught him studying her with an expression that made her cheeks warm, though she could not have said why. Later that day, a knock came at the door. Grace opened it to find Mr. Whitfield, the landlord, standing on the step with his usual sour expression, a ledger tucked under one arm. "The rent," he said without greeting. "You were due to pay yesterday." Grace's stomach dropped. She had forgotten, in the chaos of caring for Sebastian, that the deadline had already passed. "Mr. Whitfield, I need a little more time. My mother is ill, and I have heard every excuse this village has to offer, Miss Whitmore," he interrupted, his tone flat and unmoved. "Sickness, bad luck, misfortune. It matters little to me. If I do not have payment by the end of the week, I will have no choice but to find tenants who can pay." "Please," Grace said, hating the way her voice cracked. "We have nowhere else to go." Whitfield's eyes flicked past her, into the cottage, and landed on the figure resting near the fire. His expression shifted slightly, curiosity mixing with suspicion. "Who is that?" "A traveler. He was injured on the road. I am caring for him until he recovers." "You are feeding strangers when you cannot feed yourselves." Whitfield's laugh was short and without humor. "That tells me all I need to know about how seriously you take your debts, Miss Whitmore. The end of the week. No later." He turned and left without another word, and Grace closed the door slowly, leaning her forehead against the wood for a moment, before turning back to face the room. When she looked up, Sebastian was watching her, his expression unreadable. "I am sorry," he said. "I have brought trouble to your door along with myself." "The trouble was already here before you arrived," Grace said, forcing a tired smile. "You have simply witnessed it up close. How much do you owe him?" "More than I have," she admitted, sitting down heavily on the stool beside the fire. "I was on my way to sell bread the morning I found you. That bread would have brought in barely enough to cover half of what we owe, and now even that chance is gone, since it went to feeding you instead." She had not meant the words to sound like an accusation, but she saw them land on him anyway, saw the flicker of guilt cross his face before he masked it. "I will find a way to repay you," he said, "for the bread, for the care, for all of it." "You are a wounded traveler with nothing but the torn clothes on your back," Grace said gently. "I do not expect repayment from a man who has nothing to give." Something in his expression shifted then, something almost amused, though he quickly hid it. "You would be surprised what I have to give," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Grace did not catch the full meaning of his words, too tired and too worried about the coming week to notice the strange certainty in his voice. She busied herself with supper instead, stretching what little food remained into something that might fill 3 stomachs, even if only barely. That night, after her mother had fallen into a restless sleep, Grace stepped outside to gather more wood, though the pile by the door was already nearly gone. The cold air stung her lungs, and above her the stars stretched out in a wide, indifferent sky. She stood for a moment, letting the silence settle over her, trying not to think about Whitfield's ledger or the empty space where Flower used to sit in their kitchen. The door creaked behind her, and she turned to find Sebastian standing in the frame, wrapped in a spare blanket, watching her with concern. "You should not be out here in the cold," she said. "Your wound has not fully closed." "Neither should you," he replied, stepping carefully down onto the frozen ground beside her. "Yet here we both are." She managed a small laugh despite herself. "I suppose neither of us listens to good advice." They stood together in the quiet for a while, the only sound the wind moving through the bare branches overhead. Grace found herself glancing at him more than she meant to, taking in the way the moonlight caught the sharp line of his jaw, the quiet intelligence in his eyes even now, tired and healing as he was. "Tell me something true about yourself," she said suddenly. "Not where you were going or who attacked you. Something simple, something real." He considered the question longer than she expected. "I used to love the sound of rain on rooftops when I was young," he said finally. "It made me feel as though the whole world had paused just to listen. I have not heard it in years without thinking of duty, of obligations waiting on the other side of the storm." "That is not so simple after all," Grace said softly. "No," he agreed. "I suppose very little about me is simple anymore." "Well," she said, pulling her shawl tighter, "when I was young, my mother used to tell me stories by this very fire, about knights and distant kingdoms, before we lost everything, and the stories stopped feeling like anything but foolishness. I used to believe good things happened to good people. I am not certain I believe that anymore, but some nights, sitting here with you, I remember what it felt like to hope." Sebastian turned to look at her fully then, and something passed between them that neither of them named aloud, a quiet understanding that went deeper than the short days they had known each other. "Perhaps hope is not as foolish as it seems," he said. "Perhaps it simply takes the right circumstances to prove itself true." They returned inside not long after, the cold finally driving them back toward the fire, but Grace carried the weight of that conversation with her long after she closed her eyes that night, turning his words over in her mind like a puzzle she could not quite solve. Over the following days, Sebastian's strength continued to return, though he was careful never to overexert himself in front of her, as though he did not wish her to see just how quickly his body was healing. Grace noticed it anyway. She noticed the way he moved with more ease each morning, the way his voice grew steadier, the way his eyes, once dulled with pain, had begun to sharpen with quiet observation. She noticed other things too, the careful, precise way he spoke, as though he had been trained since childhood to choose his words with purpose. The way he studied the cottage, not with pity, but with genuine curiosity, asking questions about how she managed the household, how she stretched so little food to feed 3 people, how she found the strength to keep going when circumstances offered her so little in return. "You ask a great many questions for a man who answers so few of his own," she told him one evening, as they sat near the fire while her mother slept. "I find your life more interesting than mine," he said simply. "That seems unlikely, given that you were nearly killed on a public road." "Violence is not interesting," he said, his voice low. "Endurance is. You wake every morning not knowing if you will have enough to eat, not knowing if the roof over your head will still be yours by week's end, and yet you found room in your heart to save a stranger who could offer you nothing in return. That is far more remarkable than anything that has happened to me." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks again, unused to being spoken of with such sincerity. "You give me too much credit. I did not think it through. I simply could not leave you there." "That is precisely what makes it remarkable," he said. "You did not calculate the cost before you acted. Most people calculate first and act second, if they act at all." She did not know how to respond to that, so she let the silence settle between them, comfortable despite everything hanging over her family's future. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the thin windows, and Grace pulled her shawl tighter, aware of how few days remained before Whitfield's deadline arrived. The next afternoon, Grace walked to the village well to draw water, and found herself the subject of whispered conversation among the women gathered there. They had heard, of course, that a stranger was recovering in her home, and speculation had already spread faster than she could have anticipated. "They say he speaks like a gentleman," one woman murmured to another, not quite quietly enough. "My husband saw him through the window and swears his boots were finer than anything a farmer could afford." Perhaps he is a merchant fallen on hard times, another suggested. Or a thief, pretending to be something grander, a third added, casting a wary glance toward Grace as she approached. Grace kept her eyes forward and said nothing, filling her bucket in silence before turning back toward home. She had heard enough gossip in her life to know that engaging with it only fed the fire, and she had far more pressing matters to worry about than the opinions of women with nothing better to do than speculate about her guest. Still, their words lingered in her mind as she walked, stirring a question she had been trying to ignore. Who exactly was Sebastian, and why did everything about him, from his manner of speech to the calluses that did not quite match a laborer's hands, suggest he was far more than the simple traveler he claimed to be? By the time she reached the cottage, she had resolved to ask him directly, plainly, without dancing around the subject any longer. But when she stepped inside and saw him sitting up, color returned to his face, a rare, easy smile touching his lips as her mother recounted some old memory from years past. She found she did not have the heart to disturb the fragile peace that had settled over their small home. Whatever truth he was hiding, she told herself, could wait one more day. There would be time enough for questions once the immediate danger of the week's rent had passed. She was wrong, though she did not know it yet, and the truth would arrive far sooner than she expected, carried not by her own questions but by riders whose horses were already thundering down the road that led straight to her door. She did not know that even as she sat by the fire, worrying over coins she did not have, riders were moving steadily closer along the roads beyond the village, searching every inn and every farmhouse for a missing nobleman. She did not know that the man resting beside her fire held more power to change her fortune than she could have imagined, or that his silence about his true identity was not born of deception, but of fear. Fear that revealing the truth too soon might place her in far greater danger than poverty ever could. For now, Grace only knew that the stranger she had saved was healing, that her family's future remained uncertain, and that despite everything, she found herself looking forward to their quiet conversations by the fire more than she was willing to admit, even to herself. The sound of hooves thundering down the village road tore Grace from her sleep before dawn. She sat up quickly, heart pounding, listening as the noise grew louder, closer, until it seemed the very ground beneath the cottage trembled with it. Her mother stirred with a soft moan, and across the room, Sebastian was already on his feet, moving toward the window with a tension in his shoulders she had not seen since the night she found him. "What is it?" Grace whispered, pulling her shawl around herself as she rose. "Riders," he said quietly, peering through the gap in the curtain. His voice had changed, gone sharp and alert in a way that startled her. Many of them. The hoofbeats slowed as they reached the small cluster of cottages, and Grace heard raised voices outside, men calling to one another, doors being knocked upon further down the lane. Fear coiled tight in her stomach. Riders arriving in such numbers, at such an hour, never brought good news to families like hers. A heavy knock struck her own door moments later, firm and commanding, nothing like the tentative knuckles of a neighbor. Grace exchanged a glance with Sebastian, who had gone very still, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Open in the name of the Duke of Ashworth," a deep voice called from outside. "We are searching every home in this village." Grace's breath caught. She looked to Sebastian for guidance, but he had turned away from the window, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance as though bracing for something he could not avoid. She crossed to the door with trembling hands and opened it to find a tall man in fine riding clothes standing on the step, flanked by several armed men on horseback behind him. "Forgive the early hour, miss," the man said, his eyes sharp and searching as they swept past her into the small cottage. "We are searching for a missing nobleman, last seen 3 days ago on the road north of here. He may be injured. Have you seen?" The man stopped mid-sentence. His gaze had found Sebastian standing near the fire, and every trace of formality drained from his face, replaced by something close to shock, then overwhelming relief. "Your Grace," he breathed, dropping into an immediate bow so deep it seemed almost frantic. "We feared the worst. We have searched every road, every village, for 3 days without rest." Grace felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She turned slowly to look at Sebastian, who would not meet her eyes, his expression carved from stone as the weight of the revealed truth settled over the small room like a physical presence. "Your Grace," she repeated, the words tasting strange and impossible in her mouth. "Duke of Ashworth." "Grace," Sebastian began, stepping toward her. "Let me explain." "There is nothing to explain," she said, though her voice shook with something she could not name. Betrayal and disbelief tangled together into a single unbearable knot. "You are the Duke, the man whose lands stretch across half this county, The man every farmer in this village pays rent to, whether directly or through men like Whitfield who answer to your estate. I did not know how to tell you, he said, his voice low, urgent. In the beginning, I did not know if I could trust anyone, and by the time I understood I could trust you, I did not know how to undo the lie without losing everything that had grown between us. Everything that had grown between us was built on a lie, Grace said, backing away from him as the enormity of it settled deeper into her chest. She thought of every conversation by the fire, every quiet moment she had treasured, every word he had spoken about kindness and rarity and hope, and now she could not separate what had been true from what had simply been the careful performance of a man used to getting exactly what he wanted from those beneath him. It was not a performance, Sebastian said, as though reading the thought directly from her face. Everything I said to you was true. My name was the only thing I withheld, and I withheld it because I did not know who among my own household could be trusted, let alone strangers on the road. I was not a stranger sharing a meal with a stranger, Grace said, her voice rising now, sharp with hurt she could no longer contain. I gave you the last of my food. I nursed your wounds with my own hands. I worried for you as though you were kin, all while you let me believe you were simply a man in need, when in truth you were a duke amused by how far a poor woman would go to help someone she thought had nothing. I was never amused, he said, his voice breaking slightly. Grace, I have never in my life felt more humbled than I did watching you give away food you could not spare, to a man you owed nothing. That is not something I could ever mock. It changed something in me. But Grace was no longer listening closely enough to hear the sincerity beneath his words. The shame of it burned too hot, the realization that she had opened her heart and her home to a man whose world was so impossibly distant from her own that the very idea of an honest connection between them now seemed laughable. She had been foolish enough to believe, if only for a few days, that kindness alone could bridge such a divide. Now she understood how naive that belief had been. The man who had bowed at the door straightened and cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable at having interrupted what was unfolding before him. Your Grace, we must return you to the estate at once. Your physician is waiting, and your cousin has been informed of the search. Sebastian's expression darkened at the mention of his cousin, something cold and calculating flickering behind his eyes before he masked it once more. Give me a moment, he said to the man, then turned back to Grace, lowering his voice so only she could hear. I know I have broken something between us that may not be easily mended, but I will not simply vanish from your life as though none of this happened. You saved me, Grace, in more ways than you understand. I intend to see that debt repaid, whether you wish to speak to me again or not. I do not want your charity, Grace said, arms crossed tight over her chest, though her voice had lost some of its earlier fire, worn down by exhaustion and the sheer disbelief of the morning's events. I did not save you for a reward. I know, Sebastian said quietly. That is precisely why you deserve one. He turned then, gathering the borrowed coat Grace had given him in place of his ruined one, and made his way toward the door. Before stepping outside, he paused and looked back at her mother, who had watched the entire exchange from her bed with wide, astonished eyes. Thank you for your hospitality, madam, he said, with a small, respectful bow that seemed strange coming from a man dressed in cast-off clothing. Your daughter's kindness saved my life. I will not forget it. Then he was gone, swallowed up by the retinue of riders outside, and within minutes, the sound of hooves faded back down the road, leaving the cottage in a silence so complete, it felt like the aftermath of a storm. Grace sank onto the stool by the fire, her hands trembling now that the adrenaline of the moment had begun to fade. Her mother watched her carefully from across the room. You did not know, her mother said gently. There is no shame in that. I feel like a fool, Grace whispered. I sat with him every evening. I told him things I have never told anyone, and the entire time, he was laughing at me behind his careful words, watching a poor baker's daughter believe she had found something real. Did his eyes look like a man laughing at you? Her mother asked, because from where I lay, they looked like a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as anything other than his title. Grace did not answer. She stared into the fire instead, replaying every conversation, every glance, searching for evidence of mockery she could not actually find, no matter how hard she looked. The truth was messier than her anger wanted it to be. Sebastian had lied about his name, yes, but nothing in his manner toward her had ever felt false. That contradiction sat heavy in her chest, refusing to resolve itself into something simple. News of the Duke's discovery in their humble village spread through the community by midday, carried on the same current of gossip that had speculated about him only days before. Now the whispers took on a different shape entirely, filled with awe and disbelief that the missing Duke of Ashworth had been found recovering in the home of Grace Whitmore, the poor baker's daughter everyone had assumed was destined for nothing more than a hard life and an early grave. Before Whitfield could arrive, however, Grace found herself facing a different kind of visitor. Two women from the village, sisters named Eleanor and Charlotte, who had rarely spoken more than a passing greeting to her before, appeared at her gate not long after the riders had departed, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and something close to envy. "Is it true?" Eleanor asked breathlessly, not bothering with any greeting at all. "The man in your home truly was the Duke himself?" "It seems so," Grace answered carefully, unwilling to give the sisters more fuel for gossip than they already possessed. "You must tell us everything," Charlotte pressed, leaning in close over the low fence. "What is he like up close? Is he as handsome as they say? Did he speak of marriage, of gratitude, of anything at all?" "He spoke as any injured man might," Grace said, keeping her tone even despite the irritation building beneath her calm exterior. "He needed care, and I gave it. There is no great romance to report, whatever stories you have already begun weaving in your minds." The sisters exchanged a doubtful glance, clearly unconvinced, but Grace offered nothing further, turning back toward her cottage before their questions could grow more invasive. She understood, even as she closed the gate behind her, that this was only the beginning. Word of a duke recovering in a baker's daughter's home would not stay contained within the village for long. It would travel to neighboring towns, perhaps even to the county seat, twisted and reshaped with each retelling until the truth of what had actually happened between them became nearly impossible to recognize. She had barely settled back beside the fire when Whitfield arrived at her door again that same afternoon, his usual sour expression replaced by something far more calculating, almost obsequious. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his tone syrupy in a way that made her skin crawl. "I understand there may have been some confusion regarding your rent. Take all the time you need, no rush at all." Grace watched him with narrowed eyes, understanding immediately what had shifted his attitude so quickly. He no longer saw a poor tenant who might default on her payments. He saw a woman who had somehow earned the personal gratitude of the most powerful man in the county, and men like Whitfield rearranged their loyalties as easily as the wind changed direction. "I will pay what I owe when I am able," Grace said flatly, refusing to be charmed by his sudden generosity. "Nothing has changed about my circumstances, Mr. Whitfield, regardless of who I once gave shelter to." He left looking faintly disappointed, as though he had hoped for more warmth from a woman he now suspected held influence beyond her station. Grace closed the door and leaned against it, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. That night, alone with her thoughts while her mother slept, Grace allowed herself, just once, to remember the way Sebastian had looked at her the previous evening beneath the stars, the honesty in his voice when he spoke of rain on rooftops and forgotten hope. She did not know if that honesty had been real or simply another layer of the performance she now doubted. She only knew that somewhere beneath her anger, a quieter feeling lingered, one she was not yet ready to name, and one she suspected would not fade nearly as quickly as she wished it would. Miles away, back within the towering walls of Ashworth Estate, Sebastian stood before a roaring fireplace far grander than the humble one he had left behind, his physician finishing the last of his examinations while servants moved quietly around him, restoring order to a household that had spent 3 days in fear for their master's life. But Sebastian's thoughts were not on his recovery, nor on the relief evident in every face around him. His thoughts remained fixed on a small cottage and the woman inside it, whose trust he had broken through no true fault of his intentions, and whose forgiveness he was already determined to earn, whatever the cost. He did not yet know that the men who had ambushed him on the road had not acted alone, or that the true architect of the attack was standing closer to him than he could have imagined, watching his recovery with an outwardly relieved expression that concealed a far darker calculation beneath it. That man was Edmund Hale, Sebastian's cousin, who stood near the fireplace with a goblet of wine in hand, offering quiet words of relief to the physician and the assembled household staff, while his eyes tracked every movement Sebastian made with careful, practiced patience. Edmund had spent years standing one step behind the title he believed should rightfully have been his, watching Sebastian inherit lands, wealth, and influence that Edmund had convinced himself he deserved more. "You gave us quite a fright, cousin," Edmund said smoothly, stepping closer once the physician had finished his examination and left the room. 3 days with no word. I feared the worst." "I am certain you did," Sebastian replied, his voice carrying a coolness that made Edmund's practiced smile falter, just slightly, before he recovered it. "Do you recall anything about the men who attacked you?" Edmund asked, his tone light, almost idle, though Sebastian noted the way his cousin's grip tightened fractionally around the stem of his goblet. "Very little," Sebastian said, watching his cousin's face carefully. "Only that they knew precisely where to find us, on a road that few outside this household would have known I intended to travel that week." A flicker of something passed behind Edmund's eyes, gone so quickly that a less attentive observer might have missed it entirely. But Sebastian had spent years learning to read the subtle shifts in his cousin's expressions, the small tells that betrayed the ambition Edmund worked so hard to conceal beneath charm and false concern. "How fortunate, then, that you survived," Edmund said, raising his goblet in a small toast. "The estate would not have known what to do without you." "No," Sebastian agreed quietly, holding his cousin's gaze a moment longer than was comfortable. "I imagine it would not have taken long to find a new master for these halls." Edmund's smile tightened further before he excused himself, claiming exhaustion from the days of worry, and left Sebastian alone before the fire, with his suspicions growing sharper by the hour. He said nothing more of it that evening, choosing instead to let his cousin believe his secrets remained safely hidden. But in the quiet of his own chambers later that night, Sebastian began quietly assembling the pieces of a plan, one that would require patience, careful evidence, and allies he could trust completely. His thoughts, however, kept drifting back to the small cottage, and the woman who had shown him more genuine loyalty in 3 short days than his own family had offered in years. Whatever danger still surrounded him, whatever plot his cousin was weaving in the shadows of Ashworth Estate, Sebastian found himself unable to separate his need for justice from his growing need to see Grace again, to earn back the trust his silence had cost him, and to prove that the man she had nursed back to health was not so different from the man now expected to rule an entire county. A week passed, and Grace had not heard a single word from Ashworth Estate. She told herself this was for the best, that whatever strange connection had formed between her and Sebastian during his days of recovery had belonged to a fiction he created, a role he played while circumstances forced him into her world. Now that he had returned to his own life, surrounded by wealth and duty and a household that answered to his every word, there was no reason for him to think of a baker's daughter again. Still, she found herself glancing toward the road more often than she would admit, half expecting to see riders approaching, half hoping she would not. Her mother's health had improved slightly, enough that she could sit up for longer stretches and even help with small tasks around the cottage, though she remained too weak for anything demanding. The debt to Whitfield still loomed, though he had not returned to press the matter since his strange visit the day the truth about Sebastian emerged. Grace suspected his sudden patience had less to do with kindness, and more to do with fear of somehow offending a household connected, however briefly, to the Duke. She threw herself into work instead, baking what bread she could with the flour they had left, selling it at the market for whatever price she could get, saving every coin toward the debt that still hung over their heads like a blade. It was exhausting, thankless work, but it was familiar, and familiar felt safer than dwelling on a man whose world she would never truly belong to. It was on one such market morning, as she arranged her small basket of bread beside the other vendors, that she noticed a stranger approaching her stall, dressed simply, but with a bearing that suggested he was not accustomed to marketplace crowds. He introduced himself as a steward from the Ashworth Estate, and Grace's heart clenched at the mention of the name. "I have been sent to deliver this," the steward said, producing a small sealed pouch, "along with word that your family's debt to your landlord, Mr. Whitfield, has been settled in full." Grace stared at him, uncertain she had heard him correctly. "Settled? By whom?" "I am not at liberty to say," the steward replied, though the faint knowing look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. "I was simply instructed to deliver the news, along with this." He placed the pouch in her hands and departed before she could ask further questions, leaving her standing amid the noise of the market, with her heart pounding and her mind racing. She opened the pouch carefully and found a modest sum of coin inside, along with a small folded note. She stepped away from the busy stalls to read it in private, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was elegant but unhurried, each letter formed with the same careful precision she remembered from his voice. "You once told me you did not want charity. This is not charity. It is a debt repaid, nothing more. What you gave me in that cottage cannot be measured in coin, but I could not in good conscience allow the woman who saved my life to lose her home over a sum so small to me and so enormous to you. I hope, in time, you will allow me to repay the rest of what I owe you in ways that matter more than money." There was no signature, but none was needed. Grace folded the note carefully and tucked it into her pocket, her emotions a tangled knot she could not begin to unravel. Part of her wanted to be angry, to feel that he had once again acted without asking, deciding on her behalf what was best for her family. But a larger part of her, one she was reluctant to acknowledge, felt something closer to warmth, a recognition that his words had not been empty flattery meant to soothe her pride, but a genuine attempt to right a wrong he believed he had caused. When she returned home and told her mother what had happened, the older woman's eyes filled with tears of relief, though she watched Grace carefully as she spoke, as though searching for something deeper beneath her daughter's careful, measured retelling. "You are angry with him," her mother observed. "And yet you kept the note." "I do not know what I feel," Grace admitted, sinking onto the stool beside the fire. "He lied to me, about something important, but everything else, every conversation, every moment I believed we shared honestly, none of that has stopped feeling real, no matter how hard I try to convince myself otherwise." "Perhaps it was real," her mother said gently. "A man's title does not erase the truth of his heart, Grace, any more than our poverty erases the truth of ours. Sometimes the loudest lies are the ones we tell ourselves to avoid feeling something we are afraid of." Grace did not answer, though her mother's words settled deep and uncomfortable in her chest, refusing to be easily dismissed. Over the following weeks, small kindnesses continued to arrive at her doorstep, always unsigned, always careful never to overstep into something she might reject outright as too much. A sturdy new roof was quietly repaired after a storm damaged the old one, arranged through the local carpenter who claimed only that the cost had already been covered by an anonymous benefactor. A physician visited to check on her mother's health, refusing payment when Grace tried to offer what little she had. Firewood appeared stacked by her door on the coldest mornings, more than she could have gathered alone. Grace never saw Sebastian during any of these quiet gestures, and she told herself she did not expect to, that a duke had far more pressing matters occupying his time than a village woman he had known for only a handful of days. Yet each unsigned kindness chipped away at the wall of resentment she had built around herself, until she found she could no longer deny the truth her mother had spoken aloud that first night. Whatever Sebastian had hidden about his identity, his care for her welfare had never once felt like performance. One afternoon, while Grace was hanging laundry behind the cottage, Eleanor and Charlotte returned, their curiosity apparently undimmed by her earlier reluctance to indulge them. "We heard the roof was repaired," Charlotte said, eyeing the fresh thatch above the cottage with open envy, "and that a physician came all the way from the county seat to see your mother. Such attention is not given freely, Grace. Surely you must know something more than you are telling us." "I know that kindness sometimes comes without explanation," Grace replied, pinning a damp cloth to the line without looking at either of them, "and that some people find it difficult to accept that not everything requires a grand secret behind it." "A duke does not repair roofs for bakers' daughters without reason," Eleanor pressed, undeterred. "Everyone in the village believes he intends to make you his mistress, if not something more respectable." The words struck harder than Grace wanted to admit, heat rushing to her face, though whether from anger or something more complicated, she could not immediately say. "Then everyone in the village is engaging in idle speculation about matters that do not concern them," she said, more sharply than she intended. "I would ask you both to remember that gossip, repeated enough times, has a way of causing real harm, even when there is no truth behind it." The sisters exchanged a glance, chastened slightly by her tone, and made their excuses to leave shortly after. Grace finished hanging the laundry alone, her hands moving mechanically, while her mind churned over their words. A mistress. The thought settled uncomfortably in her chest, not because she found it offensive on its own, but because it reduced everything that had passed between her and Sebastian into something transactional, something far smaller and uglier than what she had actually felt sitting beside him by the fire. She wondered, not for the first time, what exactly the villagers imagined when they pictured a duke and a baker's daughter together. Whatever image they conjured, she suspected it bore little resemblance to quiet conversations about rain on rooftops, or the particular way Sebastian had thanked her mother, with a respect that owed nothing to performance or obligation. Word from the estate, carried through the usual channels of village gossip, painted a more complicated picture of what awaited Sebastian upon his return. Rumors spoke of tension between the duke and his cousin, of investigations quietly launched into the attack that had nearly claimed his life, of whispers among the nobility questioning why a man of his standing had vanished for days without explanation, only to be found recovering in the humble home of a baker's daughter. Grace heard fragments of these rumors at the market, in the church pews, in the low murmurs of neighbors who no longer looked at her with pity, but with a curious mixture of respect and suspicion that unsettled her more than outright judgment ever could. She had never asked for any of this. She had simply shared bread with a dying stranger on a cold road, and now her name was spoken alongside the Duke's in conversations she was not even present for. her reputation reshaped by a connection she had never sought and did not know how to navigate. One evening, as she sat mending a torn hem by candlelight, her mother spoke again, her voice softer than usual, carrying the particular gentleness of someone who had lived long enough to recognize the shape of things before they fully formed. "You think of him," her mother said. It was not a question. Grace's needle paused mid-stitch. "I think of many things, Mother. The debt still owed to Whitfield, though smaller now. The roof, the firewood. There is much to think about." "That is not what I asked." Grace set down her mending and stared into the fire, unwilling to meet her mother's knowing gaze. "Even if I did think of him," she said quietly, "it would change nothing. He is a duke. I am the daughter of a baker who died leaving nothing behind but debts and a struggling wife. Whatever kindness passed between us in that cottage, it cannot survive outside those walls. The world does not allow such things, and I have learned not to hope for what the world will not permit." Her mother reached over and took her hand, her grip weaker than it once had been, but no less steady in its conviction. "The world permits a great many things it claims to forbid, child, when the heart involved is stubborn enough to insist upon them. I do not know what will become of you and the Duke, but I have watched you close yourself off from hope more times than I can count, always for reasons that sounded sensible at the time. Just once, I would like to see you let hope win, even if only for a little while." Grace said nothing, but she did not pull her hand away, and long after her mother had fallen asleep, she sat awake beside the dying fire, turning her mother's words over and over, wondering, despite every practical argument she could summon against it, whether hope might truly be worth the risk this time. A few days later, another visitor arrived, though this one wore no livery from the estate and carried no sealed pouch of coin. It was an older woman, plainly dressed, who introduced herself only as Margaret, and claimed to have once served as a nurse within the Ashworth household many years before. She had heard, she explained, of the young woman who had cared for the Duke during his recovery, and had felt compelled to make the journey herself, curious to meet someone who had earned such quiet devotion from a man she remembered as guarded even in childhood. He was not always so careful with his words, Margaret said, accepting a cup of weak tea Grace offered her. As a boy, he spoke freely, laughed easily. It was only after his father passed, and the full weight of the title fell upon him far too young, that he learned to measure every word before speaking it, as though a single careless sentence might cost him something irreplaceable. "Why do you tell me this?" Grace asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Because I think you believe his silence about his name was cruelty," Margaret said gently, when in truth, silence has simply been the only armor that boy has ever known. It does not excuse the hurt it caused you, but perhaps it explains it. The old woman did not stay long after that, refusing Grace's offer of a meal and departing as quietly as she had arrived, leaving behind only her words and the faint impression that she had been sent, whether by Sebastian himself or by her own conscience, to soften a wound that still had not fully healed. She did not know that miles away, within the walls of Ashworth Estate, Sebastian was fighting battles of his own, each day bringing him closer to uncovering the truth about his cousin's betrayal, and each night bringing his thoughts circling back to a cottage fire, and a woman whose honesty had changed something fundamental in how he understood the world, and his place within it. The distance between their two lives remained as vast as ever, but the quiet threads connecting them, woven through unsigned kindnesses and unspoken longing, were only growing stronger with each passing day. Edmund Hale stood before a small gathering of noblemen in a private drawing room within his own modest estate, a glass of brandy in hand, his voice carefully measured as he wove a story designed to plant doubt where certainty should have stood firm. "I say this with great reluctance," Edmund began, letting his words settle over the room like a slow poison. "But my cousin's disappearance was not the ambush he claims it to be. I have heard whispers, gentlemen, that he vanished willingly, that his time was spent not recovering from injury, but pursuing an unsuitable attachment in a village far beneath his station." The men around him exchanged uneasy glances, the seed of doubt already taking root exactly as Edmund had intended. He had spent weeks cultivating these relationships, offering favors, sharing secrets, positioning himself as a reasonable alternative should the current Duke prove unfit to continue his duties. The attack on the road had failed to remove Sebastian permanently, but Edmund had quickly adapted his strategy, understanding that a ruined reputation could accomplish nearly as much as an early grave, with far less risk to himself. Surely the Duke would not abandon his responsibilities for a common woman, one of the older lords said, though his tone carried more curiosity than disbelief. "One would hope not," Edmund replied smoothly, "yet the evidence grows difficult to ignore. He was found in her home, nursed by her own hands, and has since sent gifts and repairs to her cottage under the guise of gratitude. Gratitude does not typically require a new roof and a physician's visits, gentlemen. I fear my cousin's judgment has been compromised, whether by the trauma of the attack or by something else entirely. The rumors spread quickly after that gathering, carried through drawing rooms and dinner parties across the county, each retelling adding new embellishments until the story bore little resemblance to the truth. Sebastian heard the whispers within days, delivered to him by loyal servants who had grown increasingly concerned by the shifting mood among his peers. He confronted Edmund directly one evening in the estate's grand library, closing the door firmly behind him before speaking. "You have been busy in my absence," Sebastian said, his voice low and controlled, though anger simmered clearly beneath the surface. "I do not know what you mean," Edmund replied, feigning innocence with practiced ease. "The rumors, Edmund, the whispers questioning my fitness to hold this title, conveniently timed to follow an attack that nearly cost me my life. I find the coincidence difficult to overlook." Edmund set down the book he had been pretending to read and met Sebastian's gaze directly, something colder and more honest finally surfacing behind his eyes. "Perhaps the coincidence exists because the questions themselves are valid, cousin. A duke who vanishes for days, who returns speaking softly of a village woman, who sends gifts and repairs under a cloak of secrecy. What would you call such behavior, if not the actions of a man whose priorities have shifted away from the duties this family requires of him?" "I would call it the actions of a man repaying a debt to someone who saved his life," Sebastian said, "though I do not expect a man like you to understand what that means." "A man like me," Edmund repeated, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "A man who has spent his entire existence one step behind you, watching you inherit everything simply by the accident of birth order, while I am left to manage the scraps left over. Yes, cousin, perhaps I do struggle to understand gratitude, when my own life has taught me only the lesson of what it feels like to be overlooked." The admission, raw and unguarded, told Sebastian everything he needed to confirm what he had long suspected. "You arranged the attack," he said quietly, watching Edmund's face carefully for the reaction that would either confirm or deny his growing certainty. Edmund's expression flickered, just briefly, before he composed himself once more. "I have no idea what you are implying," he said, though the denial carried none of its earlier conviction. "But I would advise caution before making accusations you cannot prove, cousin. Reputations, as we have both recently learned, are fragile things." He left the library without another word, and Sebastian stood alone amid the towering shelves of books, his suspicions now hardened into near certainty, though certainty alone would not be enough to expose his cousin before the assembled nobility who had begun to question his judgment. He would need proof, evidence solid enough to silence the rumors entirely, and he would need it soon, before Edmund's careful campaign of doubt eroded the trust of his peers beyond repair. One of those trusted allies was a former soldier named Harold Finch, a man Sebastian had known since childhood and trusted more than almost anyone else within his household. Harold had spent years managing the estate's security, and it was to him that Sebastian turned first when the investigation into Edmund's involvement began in earnest. "The men who attacked you were paid well for their silence," Harold reported one evening, spreading a collection of documents across the desk in Sebastian's study. "But money loosens tongues just as easily as it buys silence, if you know which pockets to search." One of the men, a former stable hand dismissed from Edmund's household 2 years past, was willing to speak in exchange for protection from retaliation. "What did he tell you?" Sebastian asked, leaning forward to examine the papers Harold had gathered. "That Edmund approached him nearly a month before the attack, offering payment for information about your travel plans. The stable hand did not know the full purpose behind the request at the time, only that the coin was generous enough to silence any questions he might have had. It was only after news of the attack spread that he began to suspect what his information had been used for." Sebastian studied the documents in silence, anger and grim satisfaction warring within him in equal measure. Will he testify before the assembly, if it comes to that? "For the right price and the promise of safety, I believe he will," Harold said. "Though I would advise moving quickly, Your Grace. Edmund is not a fool. If he suspects the net closing around him, he may attempt to silence this witness before he ever has the chance to speak." Sebastian nodded, already calculating the risks involved in confronting his cousin publicly. Exposing Edmund before the assembled nobility would settle the question of the attack once and for all, but it would also draw significant attention to every other aspect of his recent conduct, including the rumors surrounding his connection to a village woman far beneath his station. He understood, even as he pursued justice for the attempt on his life, that the two battles he faced, restoring his reputation and pursuing what his heart wanted, had become inseparably tangled together. Whatever outcome awaited him, he would need to face both fronts with equal resolve. The evidence, once gathered, was damning, and Sebastian felt a grim satisfaction in finally holding proof of what he had long suspected about his cousin's ambitions. But even as the investigation drew toward its conclusion, the pressure surrounding his personal life continued to mount. His aunt, Lady Prescott, arrived at the estate unannounced one afternoon, her expression severe as she settled into the drawing room with the air of a woman prepared for battle. "The rumors have reached even my household," she said without preamble, "and I will not stand by while my nephew ruins his standing over some peasant girl he met while injured and vulnerable. You must marry within your class, Sebastian. It is not merely tradition, it is necessity. The nobility will not follow a duke who cannot control his own affections." "Her name is Grace," Sebastian said evenly, "and I would ask that you not speak of her as though she were beneath consideration simply because she was born without a title. I speak of her as the world will speak of her, whether either of us wishes it or not," Lady Prescott replied sharply. "You have responsibilities, Sebastian. This family, this estate, the tenants who depend on your stability. You cannot risk all of that for a passing infatuation born from gratitude and proximity." "It is not a passing infatuation," Sebastian said, and something in his tone made his aunt pause, studying him more closely. "You cannot possibly be considering—" "I have not decided anything yet," he interrupted, though even as he spoke the words, he understood they were not entirely true. He had thought of little else in the weeks since leaving Grace's cottage, replaying every conversation, every moment of quiet honesty they had shared, measuring it against everything the nobility now demanded of him. "But I will not have her spoken of with contempt in my own home." Lady Prescott left visibly displeased, and Sebastian was left alone with a decision that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. The evidence against Edmund was nearly complete, enough to expose his cousin's treachery before the assembled peers who had begun to doubt him. But exposing Edmund would only address one half of the crisis threatening his position. The other half required a choice about his own future, one that would either confirm every suspicion the nobility harbored about his judgment, or silence them entirely by proving that the woman he had chosen was worthy of standing beside him, regardless of her birth. He made his decision on a quiet evening, staring into the same kind of fire that had once warmed a humble cottage, and the following morning, he ordered his carriage prepared for the journey back to the village he had left weeks before. Grace was hanging bread dough to rest when she heard the sound of an approaching carriage, far grander than anything that typically traveled her narrow road. Her heart began to race before she even saw the crest emblazoned on its side, and by the time it rolled to a stop before her cottage, she already knew who had come to find her. Sebastian stepped down from the carriage dressed in fine clothing that suited his true station, though his expression carried none of the distance such finery might have suggested. He looked, if anything, nervous, his eyes searching her face for some sign of how she might receive him. "You should not have come," Grace said, though she made no move to retreat into the cottage. "I have tried to stay away," he admitted, closing the distance between them slowly. "I told myself the kindest thing I could do was let you live your life free of the complications mine would bring. But I find I am not capable of staying away any longer, whatever the cost to either of us." "There are rumors about us," Grace said quietly. "Terrible things being said in drawing rooms I will never set foot in, about a duke who lost himself to an unsuitable attachment. I have heard whispers of it even here, carried back through travelers passing through the village." "I know," Sebastian said. "My cousin has spread those rumors deliberately, hoping to weaken my standing enough to seize what he believes should be his. I have gathered proof of his involvement in the attack that nearly killed me, and I intend to expose him before the full assembly of nobility within the week." "Then you have more pressing concerns than a village woman's opinion of you," Grace said, though the words came out softer than she intended, less an accusation than an invitation for him to explain himself further. "You are not a lesser concern, Grace," he said firmly. "You are the reason I have found the clarity to face any of this at all. Before I met you, I measured every decision by what my title required of me. You taught me, without meaning to, that some things matter more than what the world expects." Grace felt her resolve wavering, the careful walls she had built since his departure weeks earlier beginning to crack under the weight of his sincerity. "I do not want to be your escape from duty," she said, forcing herself to hold his gaze despite the emotion rising in her chest. "I do not want to be a rebellion against your family, something you chose simply to prove a point to people who never respected you enough in the first place." "You are not an escape," Sebastian said, stepping closer still. "You are not a rebellion. You are the truest thing I have found in a life built almost entirely on performance and obligation. I am not asking you to save me from my duty, Grace. I am asking you to help me redefine what that duty means, if you are willing to stand beside me while I do it." Grace's eyes filled with tears she had not expected, the weight of weeks spent convincing herself that hope was foolish finally breaking under the honest weight of his words. "And if I am not enough to silence the rumors, if your family and your peers never accept me, no matter what proof you offer them, then we will face that together," Sebastian said, reaching for her hand. "Or not at all. But I refuse to spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been, simply because I was too afraid to choose what I actually wanted." She did not answer immediately, her heart caught between the practical fears that had guarded her for so long and the undeniable truth of what she felt standing before him now. "There is something else you should know," Sebastian said quietly, before she could speak. "The assembly gathers in 6 days. I intend to present the evidence against Edmund before every lord and lady who has questioned my judgment these past weeks. It will not be a quiet affair, Grace. Whatever happens between us will not stay hidden in a village cottage any longer. If you choose to stand beside me, even in silence, even from a distance, the entire county will know your name by the end of that day." "You are asking me to walk into a fire," Grace said softly. "I am asking nothing," Sebastian replied. "I am telling you the truth of what awaits, because you deserve to choose your own path with full knowledge of what it costs. I will not blame you if you decide the risk is too great. I have already asked more of you than any stranger has the right to ask." Grace looked past him toward the cottage, toward the small window where her mother watched with quiet hope from her bed, and then back to the man standing before her, a duke who had traveled miles to ask for nothing but her honest choice. She thought of Whitfield's ledger, of the whispered rumors at the well, of every moment these past weeks when she had told herself that hoping for something impossible was foolishness she could not afford. "I will come," she said finally, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest. "Not because I am certain of what waits for us, and not because I have stopped being afraid, but because I have spent my whole life being careful, calculating every risk, before I dared to want anything for myself, and I find I am tired of living that way." Relief broke across Sebastian's face, softening the tension he had carried since stepping down from the carriage. "You will not regret this," he said. "Whatever comes on the day of the assembly, I will stand beside you through every moment of it." "See that you do," Grace said, managing a small, unsteady smile. "I have already given you the last of my bread once, Your Grace. I do not intend to give you the rest of my courage for nothing in return." He laughed then, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise even him, and for a moment the weight of rumors and assemblies and cousins with murderous ambitions seemed to fall away entirely, leaving only the two of them standing in the cold afternoon light, closer to something honest than either had allowed themselves to feel in weeks. Before he left that evening, promising to send word of the arrangements before the assembly convened, he pressed a final question into the quiet between them. "Whatever happens in that hall," he said, "I want you to know that my feelings for you were never a debt I felt obligated to repay. They were simply the truest thing I have felt in years, and no title, no rumor, no scheming cousin will ever change that." Grace watched his carriage disappear down the narrow road long after it had vanished from sight, her heart caught somewhere between terror and a hope she no longer had the strength, or the desire, to suppress. The great hall of the county assembly had never held so tense a silence as it did the morning Sebastian rose to address the gathered nobility. Rows of lords and ladies filled the chamber, their whispers finally quieting as the Duke of Ashworth stepped forward, dressed in formal attire that did little to soften the hard resolve etched into his expression. Edmund sat near the front of the assembly, his posture deliberately relaxed, though Sebastian could see the tension coiled beneath his cousin's practiced calm. Edmund had spent weeks preparing for this moment too, certain that whatever accusations Sebastian intended to make would be dismissed as the desperate defense of a man whose judgment had already come under public question. "I stand before you today," Sebastian began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "not merely to address the rumors that have circulated about my conduct these past weeks, but to reveal the truth behind an attack that nearly cost me my life on the road 3 months ago." Murmurs rippled through the assembly. Sebastian continued, unwavering, as Harold Finch stepped forward at his signal, escorting the former stable hand whose testimony had taken weeks of careful, quiet persuasion to secure. The man's account, delivered in a nervous but steady voice, laid out in detail the payments he had received, the specific instructions about Sebastian's travel route, and the identity of the man who had approached him with the offer. "This is absurd," Edmund said, rising from his seat, his composure finally cracking under the weight of public scrutiny. A dismissed servant with grievances against my household, paid to spin whatever tale serves my cousin's purposes. You cannot possibly give this testimony any credit. The testimony is supported by financial records, Sebastian said, producing the documents Harold had gathered over the preceding weeks. Records that trace payments directly from accounts under your control, made in the days immediately preceding the attack. I did not wish to believe it either, cousin. But evidence, unlike rumor, does not bend to convenience. The hall fell into stunned silence as the documents were passed among the assembled lords for examination, their faces shifting from doubt to dawning realization, as the weight of the evidence became impossible to dismiss. Edmund's carefully constructed composure finally shattered entirely, his voice rising in desperate protest as several guards moved quietly toward him at Sebastian's earlier instruction. "You have no right," Edmund shouted, backing away as the guards closed in. "Everything I have ever received in this family has been scraps left over from your inheritance. I deserved more than a lifetime of standing in your shadow." "You deserved the chance to earn respect through honest means," Sebastian replied evenly, though something like sorrow flickered behind his controlled expression. "Instead, you chose to nearly become a murderer to claim what you believed you were owed. Whatever grievances you carried, Edmund, they did not justify what you attempted to do." The guards led Edmund from the hall amid a rising tide of shocked conversation, his protests fading as the heavy doors closed behind him, leaving the assembly to absorb the enormity of what had just been revealed. Sebastian allowed the murmurs to settle before continuing, knowing that the more difficult half of what he had come to say still remained. "I owe this assembly further honesty," he said, once the room had quieted enough for his voice to carry clearly again. "The rumors surrounding my recovery, and the woman who cared for me during it, were not born from nothing. I did stay in the home of a village woman during my recovery from the attack you have just heard described. Her name is Grace Whitmore, and I would ask that she be permitted to stand before you now, so that the whispers surrounding her character might finally be answered by truth rather than speculation." Before the door opened, Grace had waited in a small antechamber just beyond the great hall, her hands clasped tightly together to still their trembling. Harold Finch had escorted her there earlier that morning, offering what quiet reassurance he could, though nothing he said could fully calm the storm of nerves twisting through her chest. "They will judge me before I even speak a word," she had said to him, staring at the heavy door that separated her from the assembled nobility. "Perhaps," Harold had replied honestly, "many of them have judged people less deserving of respect for far smaller reasons than birth, but I have served this family long enough to recognize honesty when I see it, Miss Whitmore, and I have rarely seen it worn as plainly as you wear it. Whatever judgment they offer today, it will not change the truth of who you are." She had thought of her mother then, resting back in the cottage, too weak still to make the journey, but insistent that Grace go regardless, insistent that this moment belonged to her daughter alone. She had thought of the last loaf of bread, of unsigned kindnesses left quietly at her door, of every small moment that had led her, improbably, to this antechamber outside a hall filled with the most powerful people in the county. When the signal finally came, she had drawn a steadying breath, straightened her spine, and stepped through the door before her courage could falter. A side door opened, and Grace stepped into the hall, dressed simply but with her chin held high despite the weight of every curious gaze turning toward her. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in the days since Sebastian's visit to her cottage, yet nothing could have fully prepared her for the sheer scale of the room, or the visible judgment etched into so many unfamiliar faces. She walked forward until she stood beside Sebastian, and though her hands trembled slightly at her sides, her voice remained steady when she finally spoke. "I did not know, when I found a wounded stranger on the road, that he was the Duke of Ashworth," she said, addressing the assembly directly. "I knew only that a man was dying, and that I had the means to help him, however small that help might have seemed. I do not regret the choice I made that day, and I will not apologize for kindness simply because it later became inconvenient for the world's expectations." A ripple of surprised murmurs passed through the hall, though Grace could not tell whether they carried judgment or something closer to grudging respect. Lady Prescott, seated near the front, watched with an unreadable expression, her earlier fierce opposition tempered now by the evident sincerity in the young woman's voice. Sebastian stepped forward then, taking Grace's hand in his own before the entire assembly, a gesture that drew audible gasps from several of the gathered nobles. "I have spent my life believing that duty and desire could never coexist," he said, "that the weight of this title required me to sacrifice anything resembling genuine happiness in favor of what tradition demanded. Grace Whitmore taught me otherwise, not through grand gestures or calculated ambition, but through simple, unguarded kindness, offered to a stranger who had nothing to give her in return. He turned to face her fully then, and the hall fell into a hush so complete that his next words carried to every corner of the chamber without effort. "I do not intend to hide this any longer, from my family, from this assembly, or from myself," he said. "Grace, I am asking you, before every witness gathered in this hall, to become my wife, not because gratitude demands it, and not because scandal has left me no other honorable choice, but because I have never in my life felt more certain of anything than I do of my feelings for you." Grace's breath caught, tears rising unbidden as the weight of his words settled over her, spoken not in the privacy of a quiet cottage but before the very world that had once seemed destined to keep them permanently apart. She thought of the last loaf of bread she had shared on a cold road, of unsigned kindnesses left at her door, of a note that spoke of debts repaid in ways that mattered more than coin. She thought of her mother's gentle insistence that hope deserved a chance to win, just once, against the practical fears that had guarded her heart for so long. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking slightly on the single word, though it carried clearly enough for the entire hall to hear. "Yes, I will marry you." The assembly erupted into a mixture of astonished murmurs and, gradually, scattered applause, as though the sheer sincerity of the moment had begun to soften even the most skeptical among the gathered nobility. Lady Prescott rose from her seat, and for a moment Grace feared further opposition, but the older woman's expression had shifted into something unexpectedly warm. "It seems," Lady Prescott said, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "that my nephew has chosen a woman with more genuine courage than half the ladies raised in this very hall. I withdraw my objections, and offer my blessing instead." In the weeks that followed, preparations for the wedding transformed both the grand halls of Ashworth Estate and the humble village Grace still called home, the two worlds blending together in ways neither had anticipated. Villagers who had once merely gossiped about Grace's fortune now spoke of her with genuine pride, claiming her as one of their own, even as she prepared to become mistress of the greatest estate in the county. Eleanor and Charlotte, the very sisters who had pressed her with invasive questions weeks before, arrived at her door with genuine congratulations and, to Grace's quiet amusement, considerably more respectful curiosity than they had shown previously. Whitfield, upon hearing the news, arrived personally to offer his congratulations, his obsequious manner returning in full force, though Grace found she could look upon his transparent flattery now with amusement rather than resentment, secure enough in her new circumstances that his opinion no longer held any real power over her. Margaret, the old nurse who had once visited Grace's cottage to speak of Sebastian's guarded childhood, arrived as well, standing quietly at the edge of the wedding preparations with tears of genuine happiness in her eyes. "I have watched that boy grow into a man who forgot how to hope for anything beyond duty," she told Grace, taking her hands warmly. "You have given him back something I feared he had lost forever. Guard it well, my dear, for it is more precious than any title he carries." Grace embraced the old woman, grateful for the small kindness that had helped her understand Sebastian's silence in those early days, when confusion and hurt had threatened to close her heart against him entirely. She thought, in that moment, of how many quiet hands had shaped the path that led her here, unseen kindnesses and honest words offered at precisely the moments she had needed them most. Even Edmund's fate, settled quietly through the county's legal proceedings in the weeks following his exposure, seemed to fade into the background of a celebration too joyful to be overshadowed by lingering bitterness. He would face consequences for his actions, stripped of any claim to influence within the family he had once resented so deeply, though Sebastian, in a small act of mercy that surprised even himself, ensured his cousin would not face the harshest punishments the law might have allowed. Some wounds, he had decided, healed better through consequence than cruelty. On the morning of the wedding, Grace stood before a small mirror in a chamber far grander than any room she had ever occupied, her mother, restored to better health through months of proper care, fastening the final clasp of a gown finer than anything Grace had imagined wearing in her lifetime. "You look every bit the Duchess you are about to become," her mother said, her eyes bright with tears she made no effort to hide. "I still feel like the same woman who shared her last loaf of bread on a cold road," Grace admitted, smoothing the fabric of her gown with hands that no longer trembled from hunger or fear, but from anticipation of a future she had never dared to imagine for herself. "Perhaps that is precisely why he chose you," her mother said gently. "Not despite who you were, but because of it. Do not let this new life convince you to forget the woman who earned it, Grace. That woman's heart is the very reason you stand here today." The ceremony that followed drew guests from across the county. Nobility and villagers gathered together beneath the same roof in a manner rarely seen in a society so carefully divided by birth and station. Sebastian stood waiting as Grace walked toward him, and the look on his face, open and unguarded in a way she had rarely witnessed even during their quiet evenings by the cottage fire, told her everything she needed to know about the sincerity of everything that had brought them to this moment. As they exchanged their vows before the assembled crowd, Grace found herself thinking not of titles or estates or the vast distance that had once seemed to separate their two worlds so completely, but of a simple truth her mother had spoken months before, when hope had felt like a luxury she could not afford. The world permitted a great many things it claimed to forbid when the heart involved was stubborn enough to insist upon them. Later that evening, as the celebration continued beneath strings of lantern light hung across the estate gardens, Grace found a quiet moment alone with Sebastian near the edge of the festivities, away from the noise and the endless stream of well-wishers offering their congratulations. "Do you remember what you told me, that first night beside the fire?" she asked, "about the sound of rain on rooftops, and how it made the whole world feel as though it had paused to listen." "I remember," he said, drawing her closer. "I had not felt that peace in years, until that night." "I think I understand it now," Grace said, looking out over the gathered crowd, villagers and nobility mingling together in a way she never could have imagined possible only months before. "It is not the rain itself that brings the peace. It is the feeling of being exactly where you belong, with no need to calculate what comes next." Sebastian smiled, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Then I hope you feel that peace often in the years ahead, Duchess Whitmore, for as long as we both shall live." "I intend to remind you of that promise," Grace said, laughing softly. "On every difficult day, this new life is certain to bring." "I would expect nothing less," he replied, "from the woman brave enough to share her last loaf of bread with a stranger she owed nothing at all." They stood together a while longer, watching the celebration unfold before them. Two lives that had once seemed impossibly distant, now woven permanently together by nothing more than an act of simple kindness and the stubborn courage to let hope win. Outside the estate, word of the wedding spread quickly through the county, carried by travelers and merchants until it reached even the most distant villages, transformed with each retelling into a story that would be shared for years to come, of a duke who nearly lost his life on a lonely road, and the baker's daughter whose simple kindness had changed the course of both their lives forever. It was not a story of grand rescues or dramatic declarations alone, but of two people who had chosen, against every expectation placed upon them, to trust in something as fragile and as powerful as an honest connection built between two strangers sharing a single loaf of bread. And as the sun set over Ashworth Estate that evening, casting warm light across a celebration that blended nobility and villagers into a single joyful gathering, Grace understood at last that the choice she had made on that cold morning months before, to share her last meal with a ragged stranger, had given her something far greater than she ever could have imagined losing. It had given her a life built not on the calculations of survival, but on the quiet, unshakable certainty of a love that had asked nothing of her except the courage to believe it was real. A full year passed before the county truly stopped whispering about the Duke and his unlikely Duchess, and by then, the whispers had softened into something closer to admiration, told now not as scandal but as legend, among households both grand and humble. Grace had settled into her new life at Ashworth Estate with a steadiness that surprised even herself, learning the demands of managing a household far larger than any she had known, while never losing the practical instincts that had carried her through years of hardship. It was early autumn when a messenger arrived at the estate carrying news that stirred old memories neither Grace nor Sebastian had expected to face again. A fever had swept through several villages along the northern border of the county, and reports suggested the outbreak had grown severe enough that local physicians could no longer manage it alone. Grace, remembering too well what it felt like to watch someone she loved suffer without proper care, insisted on organizing relief efforts herself, drawing on both the estate's resources and her own intimate understanding of what struggling families truly needed most. "You do not have to travel there yourself," Sebastian said, watching her prepare supplies in the estate's main hall, concern evident in his expression. "Send physicians, send coin. There is no need to risk your own health." "I remember what it felt like to have no one arrive at all," Grace replied, folding a stack of clean linens into a waiting cart. "Coin alone does not comfort a frightened mother sitting beside a sick child through the night. I want to see this done properly, Sebastian, not simply funded from a distance." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded, understanding better than most the particular stubbornness that had first drawn him to her. "Then I will come with you," he said. "Whatever risk you intend to take, I do not intend to let you face it alone." Together they traveled north, bringing physicians, medicine, and provisions to villages that had all but given up hope of receiving proper aid. Grace worked alongside the local women, tending to the sick with the same steady, practical care she had once shown a wounded stranger on a cold road, while Sebastian used his influence to secure additional resources from neighboring estates, calling in favors and demanding cooperation from lords who might otherwise have remained indifferent to the suffering of villages so far removed from their own comfortable lives. The effort took weeks, exhausting in ways neither of them had fully anticipated, but by the time the fever finally began to break, the gratitude of the villages they had helped settled into something Grace recognized immediately: the particular quiet relief of families who had feared losing everything and instead found themselves given a second chance. She thought often during those difficult weeks of her own mother's illness years before, of how close her own family had once come to that same devastating loss, and the memory only strengthened her resolve to see the effort through to its end. Word of their work spread quickly, reshaping public perception of the Duke and Duchess in ways that no formal decree or public statement could have accomplished. Where once the nobility had whispered about an unsuitable match born from scandal, they now spoke instead of a duchess who traveled personally to comfort the sick, and a duke willing to set aside his own comfort to stand beside her in the effort. Even Lady Prescott, who had initially opposed the marriage so fiercely, began speaking of Grace with open pride among her own social circles, quick to remind anyone who questioned her nephew's choice that few noble women would have shown such courage in the face of genuine hardship. Back at Ashworth Estate, life settled into a rhythm neither Grace nor Sebastian could have imagined during those first uncertain days in her humble cottage. Grace established a small fund, drawn from the estate's resources, dedicated specifically to supporting struggling families throughout the county, modeled deliberately after the quiet, unsigned kindnesses Sebastian had once sent to her own door. She understood better than most administrators the particular dignity required in offering help without humiliation, insisting that the fund operate with discretion, allowing families to receive support without the public shame that so often accompanied charity extended from those far above their station. Sebastian, meanwhile, continued the slow work of repairing what remained of his family's reputation following Edmund's betrayal, though he found the task considerably lighter with Grace beside him, her presence a steady reminder of why the effort mattered in the first place. He restructured portions of the estate's management, ensuring tenants received fairer terms than they had known under previous generations, motivated in no small part by memories of Whitfield's harsh treatment toward a woman who had once owned nothing but a single loaf of bread and an unshakable heart. One evening, nearly 2 years after their wedding, Grace found herself once again seated beside a fire, though this one burned in a hearth far grander than the modest one in her childhood cottage. Her mother, fully recovered and thriving under the estate's care, sat nearby with a piece of needlework in her lap, humming softly to herself as she often did on quiet evenings. "Do you ever miss it?" Sebastian asked, settling into the chair beside Grace's own. "The cottage, the simpler life you once knew?" Grace considered the question seriously before answering. "I miss certain things," she admitted. "The quiet of those early mornings, before the world demanded anything of me. The particular satisfaction of baking bread with my own hands, knowing exactly where every coin I earned had come from. But I do not miss the fear, Sebastian. I do not miss watching my mother grow weaker without the means to help her, or wondering each week whether we would have a roof over our heads by its end. I am glad," he said quietly, reaching for her hand. "I would not wish that fear upon you again, not for anything." "I know," Grace said, smiling as she watched the fire crackle before them. "And that is precisely why I do not regret a single moment of the life we have built since, however strange its beginning may have seemed to everyone around us." Not long after that quiet evening, an unexpected letter arrived from Eleanor, one of the very sisters who had once pressed Grace with such invasive curiosity outside her cottage gate. The letter carried news of her own upcoming marriage to a modest merchant from a neighboring town, along with a heartfelt apology for the careless gossip she had once indulged in during those uncertain early weeks. "I did not understand then what it meant to have your entire life reshaped by circumstances beyond your control," Eleanor had written. "I judged what I did not understand, and I am sorry for the pain that judgment likely caused you. Watching you these past 2 years, I have come to admire the grace with which you have carried both your title and your roots. I hope you will accept my sincere congratulations, and perhaps, in time, my friendship as well." Grace read the letter twice, moved by the honesty within it, and resolved to respond not only with forgiveness, but with an invitation to visit the estate, understanding better than most how easily fear and unfamiliarity could curdle into unkind speculation. She had learned through her own difficult journey that people rarely acted from true malice so much as from the narrow limits of their own experience, and she found she had little interest in holding on to old grievances when so much genuine happiness now filled her days. Sebastian, too, had continued his own quiet reckoning with the past. He visited Edmund once, nearly a year after the assembly that had exposed his cousin's betrayal, finding him settled into a far smaller property on the estate's outer edges, stripped of influence but not entirely abandoned by the family he had once tried to destroy. Their conversation remained brief and guarded, old wounds still tender between them, but Sebastian left that visit with a measure of peace he had not expected to find, understanding that forgiveness, however incomplete, mattered more for his own heart than for any absolution it might offer his cousin. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their young daughter, barely 2 years old, toddling unsteadily across the room toward her mother's outstretched arms, her laughter bright and unguarded in the way only small children could manage. Grace lifted her easily, settling the child against her hip as she continued watching the fire, struck once again by how completely her life had transformed since that cold morning on the road, when a simple choice to share her last meal had set into motion everything that followed. She thought sometimes, in quiet moments like this one, of the version of herself who had knelt beside a wounded stranger in a ditch, uncertain and afraid, acting purely from instinct rather than calculation. That woman could never have imagined the life waiting for her on the other side of that choice, the love, the purpose, the quiet joy of watching her own daughter grow up secure in ways Grace herself never had been. Yet she recognized, even now, that the woman she had been that morning, poor and frightened but fundamentally kind, remained the very foundation upon which everything else had been built. Later that night, after her mother had retired and the fire had burned low, Grace stood by the nursery window watching her daughter sleep, the small chest rising and falling with the peaceful rhythm of a child who had never known hunger or fear. Sebastian joined her quietly, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as they stood together in the dim light. "I used to wonder," Grace said softly, "what kind of life I would have lived if I had walked past you that morning, if I had let fear of strangers keep me on the road toward the market instead of stopping to help." "I try not to think of it," Sebastian admitted. "I do not believe I would have survived the day without you. Whatever else changed because of that choice, I owe you my very life for it." "It was not only your life that changed," Grace said, turning to look at him. "Mine changed just as completely. I do not think I understood, back then, that saving you would also mean saving myself, from a future I had already resigned myself to accept. I had stopped believing anything good could still happen to people like me." "And now?" he asked. "Now I believe good things happen when people choose kindness, even when it costs them something," Grace said. "Not because the universe rewards it, but because kindness itself changes the person who offers it, opens something in them that fear alone would have kept closed forever." Sebastian pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, and together they stood in comfortable silence, watching over their sleeping daughter, grateful beyond words for the winding, improbable path that had brought two strangers together over a single loaf of bread and led them, against every expectation the world had placed upon them, to a life neither could have imagined possible. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the estate's gardens, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and the promise of another cold season ahead. But inside, beside a fire that had come to symbolize everything precious in her life, Grace held her daughter close and allowed herself, without hesitation or doubt, to simply feel grateful for the improbable, extraordinary path that had led her here, one small act of kindness at a time.